started writing when I was 12 or so, and was inspired mainly by Star Trek, adventure stories. We write what we like to read. Even then, I wrote what I like to read. And then when I was 13, my English teacher handed me The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. And suddenly I had a new genre to write in, fantasy. And I was writing fantasy, but as opposed to the books I was reading, the fantasy novels, I was writing girl warrior heroes because I couldn't find any to read about. And I was unhappy with the ones, all three of them that I did find, who either gave up their swords to get married or...
and drowned in traditional roles.
Yes. Yeah. Or ran around in a chainmail bikini.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is totally impractical for cold weather.
Fighting and
well, just for cold weather.
Yeah,
for fighting too. If you do any jumping around, you're going to have problems. And also female warriors who hated other women. So I wrote what I wanted to read, which was girl warriors who liked guys and didn't dress absurdly. And I stopped writing original fantasy for a while, but at university I began to write again. I sold a short story which had no fantasy in it.
Okay.
But after I finished university, I sat down one November night with an image in my mind, and the image never made it into the book. But I started with twins, a girl and a boy, being told by their father that the boy is going to go to the palace to learn to be a knight, and the girl is going to go to the convent to learn to be a lady. And the next scene in which the twins agree to switch places, and the girl is going to study to be a knight. And scene after scene, I kept writing until 5 months and 732 pages later, I had what became the Song of the Long...
The whole
quartet.
The whole quartet? In that short a time?
Yeah, I wasn't doing a lot that winter. And it would never go that fast again. I rewrote it within the next year.
Okay.
And I got turned down 4 times by adult publishers. But I met an agent, and she said to try it as 4 books for teenagers. And the third editor to see the first book, what would become the first book, took the series. And in 1983, I published my first novel, Alana the First Adventure. I have since published in America in 27 books, I think. I lose track. And I'm working on the next 2.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
You started actually as an actor. And
I never had a career plan that involved being a writer. But it came, I was also writing when I was 12, 13, but that was mainly for my diary. But I figured out that writing about the stuff that was kind of having this turmoil inside of me actually helped me to deal with my own problems. And that turned out then to become poetry and...
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and then small tales, and then they evolved. And for a long period of time, I only wrote now and then because my main focus was doing theater. But the thing that I was brought up with a lot of tales and myth and sagas and chronicles because my mother were from Central Europe. Okay. So I was brought up with this whole stylized world, this archetypical world. And when I trained as an actor, I also trained with like archetypical theater forms, like with masks and dance and acrobatics and puppets and stuff like that. So when I started writing more seriously, it was that kind of stories that came out of me. And like you, I started publishing in '83. And there was nobody reading that kind of stuff. My first book, I thought that was for adults. The Tale of the Feather and the Rose. And it was published as a children's book, and I was kind of...
But it is being read by adults today.
Yeah, but that's the thing about these books, and also about Tamora's books, is that when you write in this kind of universe, I used to say that it's the realism of the inner landscape. And
that's a good phrasing of it.
Yeah, it's very related to old tales.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of the same things in it that most of them tells a story about somebody who's nobody that has to go through this and this and that to become somebody. And that's a story that we know all over the world, because it's a story about going from being a child, going out then for the quest to become the grown-up you're supposed to be.
My books are still seen as a little unusual because my girl hero starts as a page at 11, and when you're a girl and you're 11 years old and disguised as a boy, there are certain important changes that happen to you that you want to keep under wraps, as it were.
Yeah.
And also, this particular girl likes boys, which means as she grows older, her interests are going to deal with sex, especially since she's still disguised as a male.
Yeah.
She's going to have to deal with that. So I've been told, actually, by Jane Yolen, who ought to know a thing or two, that she's not sure I could get my books published today.
No.
Really?
And this was my second great novel. And the first one was published in Germany and the Netherlands and in France. And then they got this one, and they got really mad at me because, like, she was a girl and exactly the same age. She had to cover up for a lot of stuff, and there was like girls falling in love with her, and she couldn't deal with them because she was a girl herself.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, my German translator, he wrote me. He was really mad at me. He almost thought that I'd been cheating on him.
What is special about the fantasy as a genre? What special powers is in fantasy? Is it just it has magic, or is it just
fantasy? For one thing, it makes dangerous, what people view as dangerous issues seemingly safer, because it takes place in a world that is made up. But also, fantasy changes the power equation. You take someone who is normally helpless, like a child, or someone who is physically challenged in some way, or someone who is traditionally on the weak side of the equation, like someone who is poor, or a woman who is kept in purdah, and you give them magic or the ability with weapons, and you've changed the power equation considerably.
So is that relating to Josefine's statement about the realism of the inner landscape? Is that because this is actually what we all feel like inside?
The old literature is standing on the shoulders of the oral tradition. And these stories that has been given on for hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, we don't know. The stories that tells about something essential about being a human being. And this main story that I think almost all of us tells, especially when we write fantasy, is a story that we use when we tell the story about ourselves. We tell about ourselves as heroes in our own lives. And reading these stories gives us some more fragments to put into our own story.
It also speaks to the broken places. It speaks to where
that's nice.
People are wounded and feel they have no recourse. It helps readers, especially kids, but even adults, if something bad has happened to them and they find its reflection in one of these books, it helps them feel like they can work through it and they don't have to deal with it alone. It's not that we make people feel magical and powerful. It's that we hopefully make people feel more themselves.
That they can act in their lives.
Yes, they're stronger inside.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to say that my job is to put up signs in that inner landscapes. And I love that you say that talks to the broken places.
I love that too.
That's
It's
a wonderful,
it's
wonderful
really
spin.
beautiful.
I'm going to steal that. So.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay,
Thank you.
that's fine. We all want to be heroes. And fantasy says that if you're willing to put, well, at least my fantasy, and I suspect yours, says if you're willing to put in the work, we are all capable of heroism. We are all capable of the right act at a dark time. Fantasy is about justice. It's about idealism. In fantasy is the one literature out there that doesn't sneer when you say do the honorable thing. Honor is a real thing in fantasy, and
but do you think
it's accepted.
fantasy is moralistic? That it's
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that's one of the interesting things about fantasy nowadays is that you actually create a universe, and when you go into that as a reader, you know that in some way justice will happen, and that gives you the possibility of actually identifying with the main character, living that life, because you don't have to be afraid, because in some way you know that the writer has taken care of you.
Of justice.
Yeah, and I think that interesting thing is that it comes in the middle of the 90s, like with Harry Potter, really strongly. And that's in a period where everything else, it seems as if every rules in the world is kind of breaking down or changing.
The one thing that Rowling does better than anybody, nobody that I've read does it like her, is she writes about injustice.
Yeah.
And she writes about it a lot. Hagrid has been accused of a terrible crime and he's hiding out. And he is vindicated. He is cleared of the crime. But is he treated any better? Is he raised from his hut on the edge of the wilderness? No, he's not. Harry is bullied and mistreated and kept under the staircase. And is any of that improved for him, even though time and time again he's shown to be a decent person? And the reason that family has that house. No, not. And, oh God, Uxbridge. Here comes this woman who's supposed to be a teacher, and she virtually tortures the students. And is she arrested? Is she tossed into Azkaban? No, in fact, she's promoted. Rowling does injustice better than anybody, and she does it in every book.
But what she does also is that whatever happens to Harry, educates him to be able to deal with life in all kind of aspects. So in that way, I think still justice happens.
Yeah.
In that way that he becomes able to deal with it. And I think
actually to deal with a grown-up world in the end.
Yeah, but it's very interesting. I think it's very interesting because don't you put your heroes or sheroes through like severe trouble where you where you kind of think they're not gonna stand it.
Yeah.
All books are some kind of journey then.
Yeah, that's a good one.
You
I like
move
that.
yourself to another place.
Yeah.
And actually, it's in that way, fantasy is even more powerful because that place is stronger if it's a good writer.
Yeah, but I think like the bad reputation of fantasy has very much to do with that fairy tales that once used to be like common stories for all generations. became turned into the children's chamber
Yes.
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the beginning of the end of the 18th century.
Yeah.
And there they survived there actually.
Yeah.
And then when fantasy came up, it was so connected to like traditional fairy tales that grown-ups couldn't read it. And then when it actually came out that grown-ups could read them, then at that time there was so much lousy fantasy on the market that was by like, whenever there is a problem for the hero, some kind of magic, just like dump it down.
Yeah, that's the
So I think it has a lot to do with that.
yeah.
And I think a lot of the people who are young now, in the mid-20s, going to the 30s, they were brought up with Harry Potter, and they will keep on reading fantasy because that's part of what they read.
I think you're right.
Where you have
Yeah.
a lot of older people
Yeah.
that has never read it, and when they actually fell over it, it was
Yeah.
really bad,
Yeah.
and they're probably never going to read it. And peace be with them.
Yeah. But I think you're right. If you're already into something and you're getting older, there's no reason to stop this thing that you're enjoying.
No, like this series with Mira, I have so many readers who writes me and say, well, I read it first time when I was 12,
Yeah.
and now I'm 32 and I read the series 7 times and I read something new out of it every time.
That's fantastic.
But that's what it's actually. That's the interesting thing about
Yeah.
fantasy, I think, is that you can read it on that
Yeah.
level that does have a really plot-driven story, and you get whoa, page turner.
Yeah.
And if it's a good fantasy, you can go back to it and you can read it on different levels.
Yeah.
And that's why I experience, like when I come out to some of my speeches on the libraries, I have like children, young children, their parents, and sometimes their grandparents.
Yeah.
And one of them said to me once that your books are like family gatherers because they read it all and they use it for talking about important things. And I think that's what
That's
they
the
can.
role of the old fairy tale.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think
the fairy tale who wasn't afraid of
well,
being
this
scary.
this is a book, but a book is just a story with the
Exactly.
cardboard around it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's a story that's important.
That comes from the oral
Yeah.
tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that is what fantasy can. It can bond generations together because you can read it on different levels.
It's interesting. I think fantasy especially gives kids a chance also to be real characters, not somebody shoved off into a corner. And kids are active characters. They won't sit around like most adults and wait for something to happen. They will go out and force it to happen, even if it's the wrong thing. That's why they're so much fun to write about.
And they're perhaps harder to figure out. They can do surprising things
Yeah.
more than an adult character can do.
Yeah, and adults will read about kids because everybody's been a kid.
Yeah, that's a good thing because this is something that we all have experience with. And that's also why a lot of grown-ups would actually have fun or find it interesting to read fantasy because we haven't all been red-haired, but we have all been kids.
Yep.
And for every grown-up, there is a kid inside of it. And that's the kid that gets hurt, and that's a kid who feels sorrow, and that's a kid who gets really angry. And it's in a grown man's body, but it's still the kid. And that's what fantasy gives you the opportunity is to go back to that place and go on that journey with the character in the fantasy and the inner landscape.
Yeah.